Hello, everyone. And thank you so much for coming to this panel on Roe v. Wade and the global Fightback. My name is Dalia Gebrial. I'm a last-minute fill-in chair. I know you guys were expecting Moya, so I'm very sorry. If you squint, I kind of look a bit like her, so maybe that will kind of make up for it. So we are so excited to be rounding up the first day of TWT with tonight's incredible lineup on this obviously incredibly important and, for many of us, distressing topic. So as I'm sure you are all aware, Roe v. Wade was overturned earlier this year by the US Supreme Court, opening the door for the criminalisation of abortion in the US. And whilst I'm sure it felt really shocking to a lot of us, particularly in Britain, this was decades in the making. For years, right-wing movements across the globe have been gaining a lot of power and disciplining people's bodies, whether it's through state sexual violence, through attacking reproductive rights, punishing trans people for merely existing, or reinforcing traditional conservative gender roles. The movement is growing, and it's a threat to the lives of so many of us. So this panel basically seeks to chart the connections between these different strategies that the right are deploying, and looking at how we can build solidarity across struggles and borders, building the kind of coalition that can really reckon with this increasingly successful movement, which is focused on policing reproductive rights and bodily autonomy around the world. And as we have seen in the inspiring and incredible scenes coming out of Iran right now, wherever patriarchy exists, people are resisting it. And so the question really is, how can we resist together? So to give you an idea of the format, after introducing our panelists, we will hear from each speaker for about 7 minutes. Then we'll have a little bit of facilitated panel discussion led by myself, and then we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for audience questions. So write down any questions that you might have while our panelists are speaking, and you should be able to get a chance to ask them directly to our speakers. So I'm going to start by introducing our speakers. So first up, we have Belle Ribeiro-Addy, who is the Labour MP for Streatham and co-chair of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs. It's not an easy gig. Then we have Siobhan Mcgurk, who is a lecturer at Goldsmiths, specialising in gender, sexuality and migration. They're also an editor at Red Pepper magazine and of Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry. We have Mallory Moore, a researcher with Trans Safety Network, which tracks and uncovers organised harm within an intersectional community defence framework. And finally, we have Marta Kotvas, who is a PhD student at UCL who researches right-wing populism, nationalism, modern Polish Catholicism, and she's also a pro-choice activist who has campaigned for reproductive rights in Poland. So we're going to start at the end of the table. We're going to start with Belle, who will, be our first speaker and open the panel for us.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you firstly for having me, and actually for putting this on in the first place. I think it's really important for us to show that we're not just going to roll over and take it, and that we're clear that if it can happen over there, that it can happen over here too. And just say the overturning of Roe v. Wade should be a really, really worrying wake-up call for women's rights activists all over the globe. And it's a reminder that under this patriarchal system, our rights as women are never safe. These attacks on the rights of women, specifically in the States, aren't only backwards and archaic, but they're really, really dangerous. Anti-abortion laws don't stop abortions. We have to be really, really clear on that. And women won't stop accessing abortions just once these individual states in the US pass legislation to criminalise them. Anti-abortion laws will only just make any abortion that they seek to have or go on to have very unsafe. The women that these laws are claiming to protect are going to seek all of these alternative means to access vital healthcare and put their lives at risk. But it's really important also to remember that the overturning of Roe v. Wade was never about women's safety or protecting future generations at all. Anti-abortionists are always going to try and frame their arguments in one of these two ways. But if we're being honest, if they cared so much about women's safety, then they wouldn't be seeking to criminalise abortion, because it does the absolute opposite, and particularly wouldn't be trying to criminalise abortion when a mother's life is at risk. Instead, they would look at pointing their attention towards improving women's access to healthcare, reducing maternal mortality figures, and in the US it's quite similar to ours, particularly when I think of black women and Asian women and how many more times they're likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth. And for example, in the US, they would be doing something like introducing a universal healthcare system that's free at the point of use. And in the same vein, if it was all about the life of an unborn child, if that was their primary concern, they would focus on policy initiatives that would improve the lives of children and young people, such as access to free school meals, ending child poverty, adopting public health approaches to youth violence and drug misuse. And if people like Ted Cruz really cared about the lives of children, he would take steps to protect children when they're at school and support gun control legislation. And most importantly, they would adopt measures to tackle the climate crisis so that there was a healthy planet for all these future generations that they claim that they're going to protect. Instead, what we're seeing is that the concern for children seems to be only present pre-birth. And once the child is born, all of that, their concern seems to go out the window. So for these people advocating for a rollback on women's reproductive rights, let's just be clear, they're not pro-lifers, as they claim to be. They're pro-restricting women's bodily autonomy and controlling almost every aspect and intimate aspect of their lives. And rather than focusing on policy areas that will actually protect women and future generations, they choose to control what we as women can do with our bodies. And it serves purely to remind us that under a patriarchal capitalist system, our primary purpose as women and birthing people is to reproduce the next generation of workers. Anything else is secondary to that. And all of our hard-won and hard-fought-for rights are something for the system to give and take away whenever they would like. And as a person of faith, I'm a Christian, the idea that doing this is some holy means, I think, is completely wrong as well, because there's a reason why the movement has always been called a women's right to choose. Yes, we're here advocating abortion rights, but it's been called a women's right to choose because it's what a woman can do with her own body. And for all of those of faith that advocate that this shouldn't happen, I think to myself, do they really think that there's going to be some sort of cuddly pastor in the room every single time a woman wants to have an abortion? If they're handing away those rights, they're handing it away to somebody like that. That's just not going to be the case. And if you hand away that bodily autonomy, you're going to get to a situation where people start determining who it is that can and can't have children. And we've seen that people go down that route before, and we know how racist it can be and how classist it can be. So we need to understand that is really, really crucial here as well. It's about our bodily autonomy. And when we look at all of the plans to overturn Roe v. Wade being leaked last year, many of us were saying that we need to see and have a look at what it could spell for reproductive rights in the UK. And we were told that we'd be fear-mongering, but I'm looking at the current government, I'm clear that that's not the case. We've got Conservative MPs who are advocating for it to be a topic of debate which we haven't had for some time. We have an equalities minister who has shown an apparent lack of interest in women's reproductive rights, and she hasn't even bothered to turn up to votes on the matter. The new health secretary has in the past advocated for women wanting to access abortion to be subjected to mental health assessments, and has repeatedly taken stances that go against the advice of leading medical bodies. And vocal anti-abortionist Jacob Rees-Mogg once again finds himself in a cabinet position. And, you know, also the Foreign Secretary and our new Prime Minister oversaw the deletion of a commitment to abortion rights from a multinational pact on gender equality. So these things are already happening here. And whereas Britain should be setting an example when it comes to reproductive rights, particularly in the wake of Roe v. Wade, what we're seeing instead is them slipping backwards and being overtaken by countries in Europe and countries in Latin America who are heading towards decriminalisation. And what the Tories have shown us is that with their 80-seat majority, they can and will remove our rights whenever they want to. They've come for our right to protest. They've launched an attack on our human rights. And in that bill, which they've shelved, which they promised to bring back and make worse by the end of the year, they haven't included anything on reproductive rights. They're coming for our trade union rights, workers' rights overall. And with the ideologically backwards minds of the people in these top positions in this new cabinet, there's a real concern that they're going to come for our reproductive rights. So whether it's over in the US or in Northern Ireland or here, when a woman's right to choose comes under threat, we have to stand loudly and clearly in defense of them. And we need to make clear to governments abroad and to our own government that we're not going to accept any rollback on our rights, whether it's a minor change in a multinational pact or for it to be debated in the House of Commons in the way that it has been disgracefully before. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Belle. I think it's really important, especially with this government, to always keep in mind that nothing is sacred and that things can change very, very quickly. And so particularly with the global nature of this movement, nowhere is safe. So we're now going to move on to Mallory Moore from Trans Safety Network.
Cheers. So I'm a researcher. I primarily monitor mobilisations organising harm to trans community in the UK. I kind of want to acknowledge on this panel, I've never had a uterus, never will, and there's like potentially reasonable questions as to why I'm here, and I hope that I'm able to contribute something. Attacks on reproductive health services, including trans healthcare, gynecological healthcare and obstetric healthcare, and around domestic abuse provision have been a key front in anti-trans activism over the last 5 years. A lot of the hate that we monitor has been hate that's been targeted at traditionally women's services over their inclusion of trans men. There's been a lot of hate targeted at pregnancy-related services, and it's like in the UK, as well as that, anti-trans legal activism has been pioneered and largely waged by anti-abortion legal groups, and many legal cases have been funded by those anti-abortion organisations. Around the world, this wider so-called anti-gender movement has been focused on fighting against abortion, feminism, and LGBT equality, all together as part of a united front against all three. Simultaneous with a rising nationalist, often generally speaking white nationalist or otherwise ethno-nationalist tendency in politics worldwide. And after decades of progress in many parts of the world, it's worth asking, why is this happening? And the superficial answer is to focus on hate, to focus on prejudice, and to look at sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and make it really individual, not look at the systemic causes of it. But I would like to draw back for a bigger picture from that personally, from my intuitions from my research, is that there are three systemic aggravating factors One of them is our developing ecological and economic collapse that's happening. We've had 10 years or 12 years of austerity. Well, I mean, depending on when they called the end of austerity, but like, you know, we're in an economic crisis right now in this country. We've got the evolving impact of colonial extraction and the resulting conflict-driven migration. And we've got the way that the far right in America, the far right in the UK, far right across Europe, far right pretty much everywhere, has exploited the impacts of these in order to create like ethno-nationalist arguments around the climate. We've got eco-fascism on the rise. And also to drive white replacement conspiracy theories, which have massively boomed in the last 10 years. All of these amount to a drive towards controlling reproduction and controlling reproductive autonomy, needing to like nationalize and control these at a cultural level. There are also growing movements driven largely by white women towards like return to tradition. There are feminists who have ceased to become feminists and are now writing books about how the sexual revolution got things all wrong, and we need to return to like 1950s style motherhood ideals and things like that. We see this in America as a fallout from strongman politics taking the wheel, which is what ultimately led to the fall of Roe v. Wade via installing very biased judges in the Supreme Court. And I see it when we see it in anti-trans, like one of the key anti-trans texts is a book called Irreversible Damage, and on the cover of it you see a little doll-like white girl with a hole cut out where her abdomen is representing her stolen uterus. So we have like this image of innocence that's been like corrupted and taken away by the so-called trans cult. And I see it when I'm monitoring activists trying to hijack trans healthcare in the UK. What's one of the resources that recently came into my hands had them talking about how there's the rising number of trans patients in the NHS, which is, anyone else will tell you, is a result of having better information available and better access to services. But one of the slides in a slide deck they've been trying to push around is like, oh well, these kids are overrepresented white kids and not black kids, and rather than suggesting that maybe black kids are being discriminated against in the healthcare system, which is almost certainly the reason for this, the suggestion instead is that somehow we're sterilizing and mutilating white children, which is like, that kind of stuff is infecting. These are campaigns that are trying to hijack and take over our healthcare system. Sorry, so there's a lot of information there. I'm going to wind back. In America last week, it's also included photo sheets published on Fox News, where they had photos of gender clinicians. Well, I say gender clinicians. They had photos of leading figures in a children's hospital who were labelled as the people responsible for mutilating children, and these are leading to bomb threats. This has happened as a result of the abortion movement, anti-abortion movement, for decades now, and it's nothing new that there are these people, but it's happening through the anti-trans reaction as well. So to round this all out, I just want to say, like, my call to action here with my 7 minutes is to say, we need to understand, we need to no longer give lip service to the intersectionality of all of this, the way that, national migratory politics, the way that racial supremacist politics all feed into the way that gender politics works. Not to overcomplicate things, but we also need to make we need to make gender a central and not a peripheral part to resisting global fascism. Because if we fail to do that, if we lean on relative older, more traditionalist kind of macho styles of resistance to the far right, then not only are we abandoning abortion rights, but it is the key front right now where these things are being fought. And yeah, misogyny and transphobia are central to us, are a central part of this, and it needs to be a central part of socialist resistance.
Thank you so much for that, Mallory. I think the point about the way you outline how transphobia is like a key organizing principle of the far right, always has been, and certainly is now, is really important, and it ties together so many of the themes of not just this panel, but this festival together in a really neat and profound way. So we're now going to go to Siobhan from Red Pepper and Goldsmiths.
Thank you so much, and thank you for these really wonderful and inspiring and insightful and important words from both of you so far. I'm going to offer two kind of main points here. I lived for a long time in the United States where I did a lot of my research, and I think internationalism is really important, and obviously we're talking about Roe v. Wade. And so I want to talk about the long histories of various movements for birth control and abortion and reproductive rights and freedoms, as we now may call them, and think about the inclusions and exclusions that have been historically written into those movements, and then also thinking about what we can learn from international struggles for reproductive rights and freedoms over the last few years. I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about the history of birth control clinics in the United Kingdom. So it was started by someone called Mary Stopes, whose name might be familiar to you. And this is someone who was a eugenicist, someone with very overtly racist ideas, very ableist ideas, and who felt that birth control and in private talked about abortion, but in public kind of was not so overtly for abortion, but she felt that these things were useful to kind of stop undesirable peoples from procreating, right? So that's a really important history, and it's one that is... she also was a proponent of forced sterilization, and that's a history that's mirrored in the United States. So there, Margaret Singer, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood Foundation, another name that you might be familiar with, she was someone who was overtly white supremacist and ableist as well. And this has been raised a lot to kind of attack Planned Parenthood, and I'm not doing it for that reason. I want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting that the movement, that Planned Parenthood now is what it was then, and Planned Parenthood have importantly denounced her work. But I want to emphasize these histories because in the United States, the overturning of Roe v. Wade was not the moment that marked the end of access to reproductive rights and freedom for a lot of people, particularly people of color, particularly immigrant people who, for example, in the California state prison system, up until 2014, women were being subjected to coerced and forced sterilization, so removal of their ovaries and womb, in some cases without their knowledge, and certainly without their consent, on the basis of other procedures such as removing a cyst. Kelly Dillon had her womb removed at age 24 on that basis. The Handmaid's Tale has been evoked a lot since Donald Trump came into the White House. It's important to note that when people say we're heading towards the Handmaid's Tale and the reality that represented, actually that book was inspired by things that the US had done. So the systematic rape of enslaved women in order to increase your number of slaves owned was something that happened to women in the United States. People put on reservations, indigenous people again, systematically targeted for forced sterilisation and birth control being pushed really heavily on these populations and other populations that are under the, and I apologise for this language, but feeble-minded was one terminology, deviant and criminal. So in the United States, we cannot fall into the trap of thinking about this Roe v. Wade was the beginning and end point, right? Because it's a bigger picture. And it means that learning from that means that we can be attentive to the ways in which outside the legislative system, some people are given access to and some people are excluded to reproductive rights and freedoms, and some people are just denied the ability to choose from themselves. Sorry, that is very depressing, and I know it's very heavy, but I think it's really important to be said. Basically, because if we manage to get in the US, we manage to get some legislation brought back in, there's no guarantee then that it will be equally accessible, right? So we know that bomb threats to abortion clinics, assassinations of clinicians who were providing abortions historically had been such a tactic that access was squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and to the point that, you know, in some states you had to travel significant distances just to meet someone who would be willing to give you what you were legally entitled to, right? So there's different ways of squeezing access. In the UK, the cut to overseas development funding actually had a bigger impact on the funding of women reproductive health internationally than Trump's official banning of funding for that reason, because of the ways in which UK development funding was being used. So there's these insidious ways that things that are not under the kind of headline title of access and abortion access and access to reproductive health services can still be going on otherwise. So that's the depressing bit. The good news and the positive news that I think we can learn from are the ways in which movements internationally have really fought and made huge wins over the recent years. In South America, it's already been mentioned, this has included the Pañuelo Verde movement, which is the green scarf, and that's been taken up, it's including into the US now, which is really important, how the US can learn from Latin America about how to campaign, but also how to build inclusive intersectional campaigns. So in Argentina, the green scarf comes from a history of the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo who were campaigning for their disappeared children and grandchildren, bringing them on side and saying that this is part of an ongoing feminist movement. This is about human rights. This is about social justice, and it has ties back to everyone who was fighting against the dictatorship. It has ties to people who were fighting for the gender ID law, joining the travestis and trans movement. It has ties to people who are fighting for same-sex marriage and LGBT rights, right? And they managed to build this incredible movement that put so much pressure on the government that the government eventually voted to kind of move towards legalization. It kind of moved on to Mexico, moved on to Colombia this year, the beginning of this year. But as Roe v. Wade tells us, we can't stop there, right? Because rights can be overturned. These laws can be taken back. So the movement has to keep going and meeting people where they are. I think the point about religion is really important, and that's something that we can learn from Ireland about meeting people where they're at. So in Ireland, a different mechanism was used of a referendum, and in the end, an overwhelming win. But it wasn't the first referendum. In Ireland, there'd been referendums in the 90s, in the 80s, about the same issue. And so new tactics had to be embraced. You know, how do we bring people on side? And it's not necessarily people who are right-wing or who are kind of anti-feminist, but maybe people who have a deeply held belief that conception, that life begins at conception, right? That what about the child's right? So how do you meet those people? How do you engage with those people? What kind of conversations do you have with those people that are different from the conversations that maybe there's not much worth having with, you know, far-right traditionalists who are coming with different ideas? And that's, you know, Panty Bliss talks about that and how it was a different conversation. The referendum for abortion access was a very different conversation to the referendum for same-sex marriage, because you're meeting different people at different places. So I think I will leave it there for now.
Thank you so much for that, Siobhan. I think that point about how attacks on reproductive rights and bodily autonomy doesn't always happen under the headline of a law passed to curtail rights. But it doesn't always happen in that way, but that doesn't mean that people's rights aren't being compromised, and that we have to be and I think we have to be particularly alive to that in Britain, because it operates in different ways, and I want to talk about that more in the discussion as well. So last but not in any way least, we have Marta Kotvas from UCL.
Thank you very much. And thank you for including Central European perspective. I think in this kind of spirit of international cooperation, this is really welcome. I'm going to speak about the situation in Poland. So I will briefly tell you a little bit about the law changes and the current state of affairs, but I would like to mostly focus on the consequences of that. On the one hand, for people who seek abortions, on the other hand, of course, for activists and NGOs who try to provide them. So many of you might have heard that Poland used to be the country with one of the most restrictive abortion laws in Europe. And this is how I used to kind of open my speeches at similar events in the past. And then 2020 happened, and we have even more restrictive abortion law. We have a nearly complete ban on abortion, which means that abortion is permissible in Poland only in the case of rape or incest, or only in the case of an imminent danger to the mother's life or health. Well, how this is understood, this is also kind of problematic, because it is understood definitely a lot more narrowly than it is the case in Britain, for example. It has to be said, it was, I think, since 2015, so since the current ruling party, Law and Justice, took power, it was the fourth attempt. The previous ones were through bill proposals. This one was done in a particularly sinister fashion, because it was done through a constitutional tribunal ruling. A group of ultra-conservative MPs submitted a constitutional claim, and the tribunal, which had been captured by politicians beforehand, basically ruled that the third premise for abortions is against some other regulations in the Polish constitution, and overruled it. So this ruling took place in October 2020 and kicked in legally in January 2021. So October 2020 and the following weeks were very intense in Poland. You might have seen images from Polish streets. Despite COVID, despite nasty weather, there were enormous protests. Really, the biggest protest in the country since the fall of communism. This is what people who work on social movements and protest movements have agreed. The protests also took place in Britain. There were many activist groups active here, including in Liverpool, including in London, and of course in many other places. But those protests did not change that much, at least in the sense of changing politicians' minds. They might have, though, done something with regard to public opinion, but I will probably wrap up on that note. So the current law, I think it's very important to say, it does not criminalize abortion as such. So the person who has abortion is not in danger of any legal consequences. However, it prohibits performing abortions and helping in another person in obtaining an abortion. That means that, of course, those who are in danger of being prosecuted are doctors on the one hand, but also anyone who will assist a pregnant person seeking abortion. So it can be a partner who gives you a lift, it can be a friend who gives you her abortion pills, it can be someone who will make an appointment for you, or who will get in touch with an organization abroad who will help you. So people who do that, including some activists, can basically end up with a 3-year sentence. And nevertheless, activists have been extremely well organized and extremely active. I need to mention in particular Abortion Without Borders. This is a coalition of a few organizations that started in December 2019. These organizations are Kobiety w sieci, Women on the Web, Abortion Dream Team, Women Help Women, Ciocia Basia in Berlin, Abortion Network Amsterdam, and of course, Abortion Support Network, which you all well know. So thanks to them, some people in Poland are actually able to get abortion pills in case of early terminations, or leave the country and get their abortions abroad. What are the kind of broader consequences of this state of affairs? Well, some of them are really tragic. On the 22nd of September 2021, a 30-year-old Iza from the town of Pszczyna died of sepsis as a result of the doctors waiting for her fetus to die on its own. Well, they waited too long. So that is the first known victim of this new abortion law in Poland. Since then, there were 3 other cases that may or may not be related to this ban. It is difficult to say. The investigations are ongoing. But I think you can understand the gravity of the situation and the chilling effect that something like that has. It is an extremely dangerous country to be pregnant in, to put it frankly. The other consequences, of course, one of them is the development of abortion tourism, something that has been a common occurrence in Poland, is becoming even more common. People leave for Germany, for Slovakia, for Czech Republic. But of course, this is something that exacerbates inequality. Not everyone can afford to travel abroad and get their abortion done there. And this is, of course, where organizations such as ASN and the Abortion Without Borders Coalition help, because they also help fund abortions. What is also happening is that the doctors are afraid, and in some cases, well, legitimately afraid, because they can face consequences for some of their actions, and they are being put under pressure. Sometimes they are being kind of questioned by prosecutors and so on. There was a very kind of a controversial situation when a control was sent by the prosecutor's office to one hospital, which it was known was providing abortions to Ukrainian refugees that escaped from the war zone and who might have been raped and needed abortions in Poland. But in some cases, doctors are just kind of trying to protect themselves, and it is a convenient excuse for them, not to sign some documents, not to be seen to condone an abortion, for example, because of health reasons or because of danger to the mother, and they are in many cases not really helpful, which means that women in Poland are extremely isolated, and people who need abortions basically can rely either on themselves or on activists and NGOs. And here we are coming to the case of Justyna Wydrzyńska, who is an activist of Abortion Dream Team and who is now facing 3 years in prison for sharing her abortion pills with a woman who needed an abortion, who was a victim of domestic violence, and whose husband managed to read the messages on her phone and basically call the police and seize the pills that she got from Justyna. Even though the United Nations are putting pressure on Polish prosecutors to drop this case, her case is still ongoing, and we are waiting for another hearing. I think I'll just finish with some numbers. Maybe we'll talk about politics a bit later. But I think it is important to say that 65% of Poles are in favor of changing the law and introducing abortion on demand until the 12th week. This is the most recent poll I could find. According to Abortion Dream Team, in 2021, they helped 32,000 people obtain abortions. That is 94 people a day. And that includes 1,544 who traveled abroad for abortions. At the same time, according to the Polish law, there were 107 legal abortions in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your contributions. I think they all did a really good job of bringing together threads in so many of these that run through so many of these issues. So the first question I want to start with is, I think the thing that's at the heart of so many of these the different dimensions of this struggle is that concept of bioessentialism or biological determinism, which is this idea that, you know, the kind of body that you're born into should define your life. You know, what work you do, what you wear, how you act, how you're treated, the rights you have. And even though that is a concept that harms everyone of every gender, it's a very difficult ideological nut to crack, because I think in many ways it's one of the first lessons about the world that you learn. You know, you learn it often in the home. So how do we struggle around something? And this ties back to what a lot of the panelists brought up about meeting people where they are. How do we struggle around something like that many people, let's discount sort of the far right, the very far ideologically committed far right, many people are still often very emotionally and instinctively deeply tied to. How do we kind of like struggle around that, particularly with the difficult texture that adds? I'm going to start with Belle.
Thank you. I think what we need to do is explain to people what it might mean for them. Because if there's naturally selfish beings in some ways, we can always understand what our own situation is. And in terms of in terms of abortion, speaking of that kind of that particular situation, explaining to those people that think that, you know, women shouldn't be having abortions, that if they hand over the rights to their bodies to someone else, they may find themselves being told that they should have an abortion or they should be sterilized, making them understand that it is about rights and that everybody may exercise them in their own ways, but if they don't protect everybody's rights, they are essentially giving away their own.
I feel like I can't add anything to that. It's such a good answer. Yeah. Like I think everyone likes having choices. Everyone likes having choices. Everyone likes freedom, and the idea that people might not like someone else's particular choice doesn't necessarily mean that they're on board with the government making the choice for people. And I think that's really the key thing. Everyone needs to be free for healthcare to be between them and their doctors.
Yeah, I think the question more broadly, and Belle, the answer you gave was so succinct and perfect. But I think one thing we've seen in the US is, in an eagerness to kind of pull back some rights, highlighting kind of the most extreme cases. So there's a case of a child, a 14-year-old child, who was raped and had to kind of go across state borders to get an abortion. Of course, for those who don't know, the the overturning has meant that some states do still offer abortion access and other states don't. So that's the what's happening in the US. So it's a state by state level. But there's a little bit of a danger in focusing on those most extreme cases, right? And we see this in the law as well. So that lawmakers can say, well, in the cases of rape and incest, then we'll allow, right? And that's how we've seen abortion access eroded over the years. And we've got to, I think, be brave enough to say it is about bodily choice. It is about a person's right to choose. A person who is pregnant has the right to choose. Simply, they don't want to be pregnant. And that's the same kind of bodily autonomy. And that's as trans rights movement, as self-ID laws. And that's how we have to tie those fights together and say that it's not just for the most extreme cases. It is for everyone, and is a fundamental question of human rights.
I'm just gonna basically quote something one of the abortion dream team activists said in the Polish parliament in July. When it comes to decisions, you gave the example earlier, Siobhan, of Ireland and of the very successful referendum campaign and the result of the referendum itself. And it was a very kind of uplifting moment. But sometimes referenda are not the best tool for deciding on something like that. And Natalia Broniarczyk said in her speech in the parliament, that was when a group of activists put forward a proposal of liberalizing the law, a proposal that got rejected. In her speech, she said there is only one referendum that is legitimate, and it takes place in the bathroom. And there's always 100% turnout. And there are no bad answers, no wrong answers. So I think this really kind of encapsulates the very moment of every pregnant person and their right to decide what to do next when they see those two lines on the test.
Yeah, and I think coming back to that idea of not only focusing on the most extreme cases, even though, of course, there are reasons why campaigns do, because those extreme cases are actually not as far and few between as we would like them to be. But sort of on the other side of that, we've also talked a little bit about the roundabout ways in which reproductive rights and bodily autonomy is curbed by the state, and curbed particularly by also, right-wing street movements. That before Roe v. Wade was overturned, there were many states in the US where it was still incredibly difficult to get an abortion, and even if you made it to the clinic, that didn't mean that you weren't harassed outside of it. So what are especially thinking in the British context, where I think at the moment, touch wood, you're not seeing, direct claims to say, okay, we want to criminalize abortion, or we want to make providing abortions illegal in Britain. But what are the other ways, the covert ways, for example, through austerity and through defunding measures, in which access to reproductive rights is being curtailed, and also the idea that the state gets to mandate your bodily autonomy is becoming normalized as a concept? I think, can we start with Mallory? Would you like to start there? And then
Belle. Okay. I'm guessing quite a lot of people are aware, but maybe not everyone here is aware that there has been a growing street movement in the UK against abortion. I've been a clinic escort outside my local abortion clinic, and there was a buffer zone set up there, and the people doing peaceful prayer, have moved on to Stockport, next town over, and they're harassing people trying to use abortion services there. I think people really underrate the degree to which we are rapidly importing tactics and movements from America, normalizing harassment and abuse of people who need reproductive autonomy healthcare services, and I think like another one I'll just quickly mention here for anyone who's not aware of it. There was a doctor who's been struck off from the NHS now, but he was working with who's a cardiologist who had absolutely nothing to do with reproductive care, but he was working in the NHS with American anti-abortion groups. I attended a session that he ran with parliamentarians that I'd infiltrated, and it is, but like, and I found out about it through the same groups that are doing the anti-trans stuff. So there's my hook in for being why I'm here. Anyway, so and he was running an anti-abortion clinic through his like ties into the NHS and flying doctors out, NHS doctors being flown out to the USA to be trained in how to like lean on people who are in a vulnerable moment in their lives who need support and autonomy. So I just my only contribution is this sort of stuff's like really, really insidious, and it's ramping up really, really fast in the UK right now.
I think you're absolutely right. And in terms of how the government are financially causing or austerity is causing issues here, we're seeing a situation where you're more likely to have, you're less likely to get good healthcare in poor areas of the country, and poor areas of the country may end up having the 100 poorest areas in the country is where 80% of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds live. And if you have those situations, you're less likely to be able to access reproductive healthcare in the way that others are. You're more likely to be in a situation, that terrible statistic, Black women being 4 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth, all because the services that are being provided, which are meant to be under our NHS free at the point of use, are being run down in certain areas. It's all part and parcel of what's happening. They're clear, they know that it's happening, but they allow it to continue, and they continue to underfund our NHS in all of these ways.
To that, I'm just going to add that we have kind of different layers of control and different motivations on those layers. We have, on the one hand, politicians who are imposing austerity measures, but also we have politicians who are motivated by patriarchal attitudes, or this kind of perceived ethno-cultural threat which they construct because of the flow of migrants, and so on. So this is the kind of highest level. But on the other hand, we have also a kind of lower level of control, and maybe this is not that much the case in Britain, but in many more countries. Abortions are also heavily medicalized. So I think this development, partly caused by COVID, of the availability of safe in-home abortions for early pregnancies with abortion pills, a method that is safe, that is accessible, that is cheap, and it can be done by the woman or the person who is pregnant at home in a safe environment, with the partner, with the dog, with the pillow, with the cup of cocoa, whatever cheers them up. This is something that we should try to normalize and just get rid of this image of abortion as this very complicated medical procedure, a surgery of some sort, for which you need some very scarily looking equipment, an image that was really pumped into heads of kids at schools, in my generation, when we were taught things like that in, religious education classes and stuff like that. I think this is this kind of change of perception of what abortion can look like is also really quite important and empowering.
I think that's a really important point, because so much of it is about fear. So making people afraid to ask for access. So I haven't really got much to add to these wonderful points, other than just to name one particular group called 40 Days for Life. This is a US-based group that has specifically and consistently been targeting the UK and giving direct funding. So do you want to start a prayer outside your local hospital? Send us some information. We'll send you materials, we'll send you money, we'll send you all the talking points that you need. This happened at the Queen Medical Centre in Nottingham, hospital I was born in, and the thing that got it shut down was more people being on the other side, saying, we're here to support people, give them information and choices, and one thing that we can do, all of us here, is find out what's happening in our local communities where people are squeezing and trying to fearmonger. We can go back and provide support and provide access and raise awareness of this, and write to your MPs, write to your councils and say, this group shouldn't be here. Why are you allowing this group to be intimidating people outside of a hospital? That is not allowed, right? Because this is happening. And the other thing to kind of watch out for is the idea of religious freedom laws, right? And this is what doctors, that Mallory was mentioning, doctors being kind of encouraged, again, from outside sources, extremist sources, of saying you can exercise your religious freedom in your one-on-one conversation with a patient. And so just being mindful of how those things can be operationalized in really scary ways. So 40 Days for Life specifically works around Lent. So that's when to look out for them.
Yeah, I think that at the moment, when it comes to importing these kind of these strategies that have obviously been really successful in the US, they're in a phase of like boundary testing right now. And I think that this is the time when it's really important to organize and not sort of be complacent. Can we have a round of applause for Belle? She has to head off soon to go and do the good work. Yeah, I think so. I want to talk about this concept of safety, because we're often told by the state, by right-wing groups, that we need like brutal institutions like policing and borders in order to keep us safe, in particular to keep women safe. And we even have people who call themselves feminists who weaponize this idea of women's safety to exclude other women from the movement. Could you talk more about how this weaponization of women's safety makes it really difficult, or can make it kind of difficult for our own organizing? And how can we fight for our own vision of what safety is, and what actually is that vision? And how can we sort of manage that particular, I don't want to call it a contradiction, but kind of a talking point that can be incredibly powerful, but can actually, as we've pointed out throughout this session, makes women a lot less safe, if that makes sense. I think, can we start? I know we ended with you, Siobhan, but I'm going to go back to you. Yeah? Okay. Go ahead.
Well, one thing that comes to my mind just immediately is just being aware how this kind of divisive rhetoric works, and just being alert every time you hear that there is a group that is to blame for something. This kind of scapegoating strategy, the kind of strategy of vilifying a particular group because of women's safety, because of the nation's safety, because of, you name it, some interest of the majority, basically. This is a strategy that is used by populists very often. right-wing populists in particular use this kind of horizontal polarization. So they basically pick on a group. This is usually some kind of a minority, and they vilify them so that they can blame them for, all the bad in the world. And they have done that many times. In many European countries, you've heard about something called gender ideology. In some countries, you also hear about something called LGBT ideology. I'm not going to define it because I honestly don't know what that means. But, it is a rhetorical figure. It is a way of adding this kind of element of ideology, of something sinister, something to be afraid of, to, a minority which is vulnerable in some ways. One thing that we can do to promote solidarity is to just be always alert when this kind of divisive language kicks in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd add to that one of the most distressing responses to Roe v. Wade being overturned was a number of articles that basically said, the reason this happened was because the feminist movement has spent too much time worrying about trans rights and not enough time worrying about the ways in which our reproductive rights are under threat, which is such a load of bollocks. That, I shouldn't use genitalia references as a swear word there, but it's such a load of bullshit that it was just unbelievable. The idea that we can't fight for more than one thing at a time. That's absolutely wild, and it's a really dangerous claim. But it's this same claim that's been used time and time again in the feminist movement, right? Let's not get distracted by racism. Let's not get distracted by class issues, because why? Because we've got to be intersectional, and so I think really pushing against that's very important, and also pushing against the related absolute fetishization of reproductive organs, because we're getting this incredibly narrow idea of womanhood being related to having a set of organs that are all working perfectly well and that will help you carry a child. And that is such that's a narrowing of the definition of woman from already quite narrow to even more so, right? So if you don't have functioning reproductive system, you can still be a woman, right? When did that become a criteria, right? When did this fetishization of having functioning ovaries become a criteria to be encountered as a woman? So we're seeing this like stripping down of broader issues in a way that's just not useful. So I just wanted to echo this idea of like, you can't not have solidarity, right? Because the women's movement, the women's liberation movement has to be completely expansive. Otherwise, someone will get left out.
So to turn the question on its head, you're talking about the use of these calls to protect women, to strengthen like the state and these authoritarian structures, and to turn it on its head. I think at the core of these rhetorics, it's right to note that these are divisive rhetorics, that they're designed to divide us and turn us into like little competing single issue interests. Which is actually, if you spend any time doing kind of intersectional activism, you'll know that we don't have to compete, and we actually overlap on ground, and it makes it actually a lot easier for us to work together. But at the same time, at the core of these issues, what's being exploited are often very real issues. For instance, the issue of sexual violence, the issue of rape, domestic violence. These the rate at which those crimes are dealt with is virtually like almost no rapes get prosecuted anyway. So to strengthen this system, which doesn't actually deal with most of the problem, is like fundamentally a flawed approach to things. And we've got issues that are systemically making women, making gender minorities more vulnerable. Most of the trans people I know, when they face sexual violence, simply just don't go to the police, because if you go to the I know people who were sexually assaulted as minors who had the police go, oh, well, did you have the op yet? Well, you didn't have the op yet, so I'm just so sorry, we're not going to do anything about it. A lot of people come to learn that you can't rely on these authoritarian institutions. So we've got an issue here that our traditional mechanisms aren't fixing, and I think a core strategy responding to it is, to some extent, to respond to the rhetoric, to denounce it, discredit it, disagree with it, argue with it, but also to step aside from that and to look at the core issues of sexual violence, to look at the core issues of rape, issues of reproductive liberty, and actually solve those issues that are being exploited, and solve them in a way that brings us all together, and that takes the fight to them, because they only look like they're a solution to these problems so far as we're busy arguing with them and not dealing with the problems ourselves and creating alternatives that make people less vulnerable in the community.
Okay, so we're now going to go to some audience questions. So if you could just stick your hand up. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll do 2 by 2. So we'll have 2 questions, then we'll put it to the floor, to the panel, and then have the next 2 questions. So can we have these 2 just here? So one up there and one down here.
Hi, I might stand up. So I'm Eva, and thank you so much for your amazing panel. I'm Polish, and I've been in Poland in 2020 when the protests were happening. And the question I wanted to ask is really focused around organizational question. How do we win? How do we organize? How do we bring people together and have structures that actually make the law and also the perception of abortion in the wider society very different to what is pushed by the religious groups or other political groups that are very powerful? Because that's the question that I've been struggling with for the past few years. And I think the protests in Poland also showed that, unfortunately, it's not enough to have big numbers on the streets. And I just wanted to maybe suggest one solution, and that is having membership organizations, such as we had in Poland. We had a women's strike organization, which did not decide to have membership. It sort of turned into more of leadership organization. And I think the way to win in Poland was actually to get people who were on the streets to join the organization and to create a program and democratic structure within, so that we can actually have a political leverage and also, do this. So I just wanted to hear your ideas and also maybe how we can combine our movements.
Thank you, Eva. We'll go to the polka dots.
Thanks. I'll stand up as well. Thank you so much for all of your talks. I have a related question about kind of healthcare professionals. So I'm a final year medical student, so I'll be a junior doctor in 10 months or so, something like that. And I wanted to ask how we resist the use of healthcare professionals as part of patriarchal and state and transphobic and racist violence, because obviously there's the denial of healthcare, but then there is also the kind of recruitment of healthcare professionals as agents of state violence, so both and often complicit, not always even resisting that. So historically, sterilization, eugenics, and currently we're looking at and have to already comply with the Home Office, with the police, huge complicity in violence towards trans people. So I was just wondering, from your experiences and research, where healthcare professionals can be powerful allies and part of resisting violence, both through the denial of healthcare and through making them arms of state violence as well. That'd be great if you have any ideas. Thanks.
2 amazing questions there. So we'll start with Marta and then just go down the panel.
Thank you. Eva has just asked the best question of the evening. How do we win? Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? We had many protesters. I wouldn't be that pessimistic as you are, though. Bearing in mind the polls from 2016, when the first initiative to ban abortion in Poland happened, and the polls were showing that around 23 to 29% of people are in favor of liberalizing the law at that point, and the vast majority were in favor of keeping what used to be still very, very restrictive. At that point, the number of legal abortions in Poland was around 1,000 or just above. Since then, and I'm absolutely convinced that this is related to all those waves of protest that we've been experiencing since 2016, and in particular the 2020 wave. As I said, the percentages are very different. 65% of people are in favor of liberalizing the law, and that is between 69 and 97% of supporters of the opposition parties. So I think one very important point of pressure is to make politicians realize that this is a real issue and something that people really care about. That this is not something that is secondary, that this is not something that, oh, well, we'll deal with it later because economy, because other issues are a lot more pertinent. We do need to make them realize. I am also hopeful about a slight generational change among political elites. I think this is already bringing some fruit, at least in Poland. But political leverage is definitely something important. I'm sure you have a lot to add to that.
I think, as I was saying before, transnational learning, exchange. So how have people won elsewhere? Also, how have people keep fighting elsewhere, right? So in Argentina, in Mexico, in Colombia, people haven't stopped because they know that this is an unequal, this is going to be really, the legal change does not mean access change, certainly not overnight, right? So how are we making sure there's education as well about the availability of particular services? Know your rights education, how is that reaching outside of city centres, outside of areas of high literacy, right? So the fight doesn't stop with a legislative change, but we can learn a lot from transnational exchange. Destigmatization, I think, is huge. So people saying, I had an abortion and I'm glad that I did, is really, really important. And there's one note of caution there, that people have to be supported in saying that, right? It's a really risky strategy for a lot of people. And I was in Belfast recently, and people were reflecting on the battle in the Republic of Ireland and North of Ireland, saying, this is really hard. And actually, a lot of people weren't supported after the win, and they should have been. Because a lot of people stood up and said in their communities something that really changed the way that people saw them and treated them. In some ways for positive, and it had a positive impact, but people did suffer the consequences of that as well locally. And so how are we as movements encouraging that sharing and saying, yes, I did this, yes, it was good, and I don't regret it for a second, or saying, I feel complicated about it, right? Having those conversations, opening up those spaces, I don't feel good about it. Opening up those spaces and to make them supportive spaces and to normalize the conversation, right? That this is part of our lives, that choosing not to have children, choosing to have an abortion, choosing to take birth control, these are decisions that then might not be easy, but they're ones that we all need to talk about a lot more. The second question about healthcare professionals, I think whilst you're still in university, be talking to your faculty, your heads of school, and saying this needs to be embedded into the curriculum. Joining or creating societies like for reproductive rights within the hospitals that you're training at, asking asking the head of your department, so, you know, what kind of training or supports are we given to be aware or to make people aware of the reproductive healthcare they can get? Also, relating that to other issues, right? So, cases of domestic violence, what kind of training are people getting, future medical professionals getting when it comes to recognizing domestic violence? Another form of domestic violence is coercing and forcing partners to be pregnant. Never letting a non-pregnant moment or a breastfeeding moment, so a way to tie women into the home, into the family, and so it can be a very powerful tool for domestic violence. And so, how are the new generation of healthcare professionals learning to recognise these signs, learning to signpost people, and if it's not happening, then creating networks, finding like-minded people. Again, it can be really, really hard. Finding like-minded people within your school, within your hospital, and building those networks out, and again, opening up the conversation. So those are some ways that I think might help.
Sorry, just going back to the original question. Okay, so in terms of the first question, I think it's an evolving situation, and you know the risks much better than I do. I just wanted to take a brief moment to say how grateful I am for the support that my organisation has had from Polish activists working together on anti-trans stuff and in general. And I think like the international collaboration, the international information sharing, international collaboration, understanding what's going on, understanding, you know, how fairly major propaganda funders are operating can only happen through kind of relatively quiet background work between activists internationally, and it's absolutely key. And yeah, there's all sorts of other things that are just a huge challenge and like massive respect basically. In terms of how healthcare professionals can be allies against state violence, on the trans issue, I think if you see something that like seems funny in terms of like the big one is decentering, and this goes for reproductive healthcare as well. If you see people decentering the needs of the person who's receiving healthcare, which is pretty much a lot of trans healthcare right now in the UK, is I feel bad about this person being allowed to do something with their body, so I guess we're going to have to put them through another few years before we are allowed to give them a choice. If you see things like that, say something, like question it. It's not right. That's not how healthcare is supposed to work. And if you see that happening around, if you see people trying to do that around reproductive healthcare anywhere, you know, it's the same principle.
I'll just add briefly, because I didn't respond to the second question, following on what Siobhan said on this idea of destigmatizing. I think this is something that also concerns the medical profession. You know, this idea that abortion is evil and should be avoided at all cost. And if it happens, it is only you know, people who have been somehow traumatized that deserve it, you know, a rape victim, someone who, I don't know, let's say tried for a baby for a long time and then has a fetal malformation, and well, this is a very difficult situation and so on. I mean, let's just really forget about it. We are fetishizing victimhood, and this is something that allows for this moral superiority, which I'm afraid a lot of doctors enjoy. So this is some kind of a bubble that really needs to be pierced for us to have just a normal conversation about something that has always taken place. And as Belle said at the beginning, you know, abortions happen. No law is going to change it.
this might be, I'm sorry to be a little bit off topic, but something that's not come up that I think is really important is listening to and being mindful of disabled rights and disabled rights activists, and the ways in which access to abortion might facilitate different attitudes towards the fetal abnormalities question, I think. And so what does that mean, and what are the implications of that, and being really mindful and aware of and listening to what disabled rights activists are saying about the way to have conversations that do not imply that that babies born with disabilities should be aborted, and that is that's the necessary answer, the necessary solution. And it's a really tricky, difficult conversation. I'm not an expert in it at all, but I just didn't want that to get missed from our conversation tonight, because I noticed it hadn't come up, but it is a really important one. And I think that's the other side of it with healthcare professionals as well, of not suggesting, there's a big difference between, a fetus that might not be viable and particular disabilities or uncommon conditions that might be seized upon, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, and thank you for bringing it up. Okay, so questions. I can't. Okay, yes. So we have 1, 2, and then 3 at the back, and that's going to be our 1, 2, 3 at the back, and that's going to be our last round for today. Yeah. Was there someone in that front here? Or did I? Yes. So
Sorry, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it might be better to work up.
Thank you. And I'm going to be that really awful person and say not a question, more of a statement. But I think the point around disabled people's equality is really important, and something we've seen recently with court cases and, this argument of disabled people's equality being used as justification to restrict access to abortion is really shameful, and has been kind of sometimes misunderstood, sometimes willfully misunderstood. Actually, there are disparities in law around access to abortion depending on a fetus's impairment, but you do not respond to that by restricting access to abortion. You continue to fight to decriminalise abortion and build a world that removes disabling barriers. So I definitely think that it's really. I wanted to add that, because we've seen that a lot with the Heidi Crowther case, and some people saying, well, actually, for disabled people's equality, we need to restrict access to abortion, and to use a word that was used earlier, that is also bullshit. So thank you.
I'll stand up. Yeah, go ahead. So, hello, my name's Billy, and I am the chairperson and founder of Merseyside Trans Association, which is why I've come to this discussion panel today to learn more about Roe v. Wade. And what has basically been confirmed to me is how these groups of women who like to appear to be on the left but are more actually on the right, like to claim that they are protecting the rights of women in terms of gendered violence, and how they need single sex spaces reserved for women, and that actually discriminates a lot against trans women and AFAB people. And what's been particularly shocking is that the Labour Party have actually allowed Labour Women's Declaration, Lesbian Labour and Women's Place UK to host a fringe event and put it in the main conference booklet. And they're basically hiding behind the idea of what women want from the Labour manifesto, but in reality, it's actually talking about taking away our rights as trans people, which is not on, and it's not acceptable. And I'm sorry for kind of tagging this on and kind of like putting it on, but I feel like it needs to be said. Myself and our organisation are holding an emergency protest outside of the venue where they're holding their events this Monday at 6 p.m. in the evening. That's when the event starts, so I think we'll meet at 5:45. Now, I've been tipped off that the venue could potentially be the women's organisation on St James's Street, but I'm not going to confirm that until I've actually got intel. So we'll probably just meet up in like the Baltic Triangle nearby and then march up if it is there, or just march to wherever it is. But I really needed to get the word out, because right now, trans people like myself, we don't just need other trans people helping us. We need trans allies to show up and to prove to transphobic organisations that trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are valid, but most importantly, trans rights are human rights, and that the people united will never be defeated. Thank you.
And then we just have up there, sort of to the right, I think in a white striped shirt. Okay. I don't have my glasses on, so I'm not entirely sure. There we go. Great.
Hi. I'm no, please don't. I'm a teacher at a school, like work in education, and I run the PSHE that is taught in our school. And one of the things that I always try to do is think of new and ways to engage the students and to make sure that I'm on the kind of the most up-to-date information. So I love coming to things like this so I can ensure that the kids are as well-informed as possible. And so I wanted to ask you, how would you best educate students about abortion? And then to follow that up, we do a lot of active citizenship, so getting the students involved in trying to make change in the community. How would you advise them is the best way for them to get involved in protecting abortion rights?
Great question. Thank you so much. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll start with Mallory and then work down.
I'm going to defer on the question of how to educate about abortion in schools. I think I'm going to flag up that there's a growing there's anti-everything, anti-PSHE campaign, along with everything else that I've mentioned tonight. That's heating up as well. Bummer. I'm basically a bad news person. In terms of the points that have been made about disability and how it's treated in terms of reproductive healthcare, I think it's a really important one to watch out for. Disabled people are massively infantilized in the system, and disabled lives are degraded within the healthcare system. So there's this situation where, as a society, we're failing to deal with the ways that disabled people are being made vulnerable, and then these hate groups are able to weaponize both sides of that as a wedge issue against women's rights. But this also cuts off especially disabled women. It cuts off trans men from healthcare who are labelled, whether they are or they aren't, they're labelled autistic and told that they can't make decisions about their reproductive futures. There's all sorts of layers that this happens on, and it comes down to people being made vulnerable, and then that vulnerability being exploited, which is, I guess, my theme. Regarding the Labour Women's Declaration, I don't want to get too much into them. I think transphobic feminists are actually a very small part of the wider anti-trans movement, and they contribute to it. But we also there's a tendency to focus on women as a source of transphobia. Actually, I think they're a fringe of transphobia. I will mention that the Women's Declaration that Labour Women's Declaration are named after is a mandates as part of it a statement against research into reproductive health for trans people, which is pertinent to this. It argues for a complete rollback globally of it under women's rights. It argues for a complete rollback of any sort of recognition of gender identity under international human rights law, or under any other sort of circumstances. And at least one human rights lawyer has described it as an effort to mandate trans people out of existence. So the fact that that's been allowed by Labour is a really, really concerning thing, and I'm glad I'm not a Labour Party member.
Yeah, thanks very much for the comments and questions. I don't identify as trans, I identify as queer. I think it's massively important for lesbian, bisexual, cis people to stand up and say that these women who are speaking and claiming to speak for lesbians are not speaking in my name. And just tying it back to the question about healthcare professionals, another way I think that healthcare professionals can intervene in conversations right now is just to underscore there is a public health principle to reach the widest possible audience. And so when you say people who are pregnant, that is reaching the widest possible, that's just good public health. That's got nothing to do with cisgender, transgender. It's the same as, and I mentioned this in the last panel, publications that say gay men, bisexual men, and men who have sex with men should be aware of monkeypox, for example. That is just good public health, because men who have sex with men might not call themselves gay, might not call themselves bisexual. That is just good public health principles. And that's a really important argument that healthcare professionals can make really usefully, I think, and just to nip that conversation in the bud, that no one's being erased here. This is just good public health practice. On education, I also kind of mentioned this in the talk that I was at earlier. I think, again, joining the dots. So the way that groups like Christian Concern, Parent Power, and others are trying to shut down LGBT relationship, PSHE, that's inclusive education, and just being aware that they're also they're coming for anything that's quote unquote non-traditional as well, and just being kind of mindful of that, but kind of taking an approach of family means a lot of different things to different people, and family can look a lot of different ways, and educating from a very young age that you have your say over your body. You have bodily autonomy, even if the phrase bodily autonomy is complex and can't be understood. Telling young people, not only you have responsibility over your own body, but you do not have responsibility over anyone else's. So no one can tell you what to do with your body, but likewise, and maybe this goes back to the question about safe spaces, teaching young boys, you don't get to say what happens to anyone else. And making that a very, and you can make that maybe less threatening than I just did, with a bigger smile, but teaching young children from a very young age, you get to say what happens to your body, and you don't get to tell other people what to do with theirs. I think it's a really important lesson, and can be used to cover a lot of different issues, but one we can instill from a young age.
Just very briefly on the last question, because our lovely chair is disciplining us, and rightly so. Appreciate their intelligence. I mean, kids of all ages and young people have this great sensitivity. They spot, really easily notice any instances of lack of fairness. Any kind of scenarios when they can notice that lack of fairness is probably going to be helpful. If you have a group of 20 students in class and say, okay, well, 2 of you will not be able to marry the love of your life because we don't have marriage equality in our country, well, this is something that, for example, in the Polish context, of course, not here. This is something that would definitely speak to them. And similarly, when it comes to bodily autonomy, of course, and similarly when it comes to access to reproductive health, when you think of different law systems and different circumstances in many countries with restrictive regulations and the consequences of it. Some kind of role play, some kind of games. I'm sure there are plenty of scenarios here to explore. Happy to talk about it in a moment. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Can we have a round of applause for our audience, for our panel, and for our audience? I'll just finish up. So before we go, just a couple of reminders. TWT is only possible because of the huge amount of work put on by volunteers, which you can see sporting a very fine on-trend red throughout the festival. And we are committed to keeping the events affordable. So if you enjoyed this event, please do go and join the supporters network, which you can do by going to the website and looking for the tab on Support Us. Please also take all your rubbish with you and enjoy the rest of the festival. I think we have one quick announcement.
Super quick. It was just to say, if anyone wants to read more about the Argentina case, if you go to the Red Pepper website, which is redpepper.org.uk, or just Google Red Pepper Argentina. Well, maybe you'll get recipes then, but go to the Red Pepper website and search Argentina if it's not on the landing page. And it's I think it's a useful learning tool to learn from that case. Thank you so much, everyone.